Okay, perfect. So can you see my screen?
Yeah, no good.
Okay, perfect. So let's begin with a few announcements. First, let me remind you all that the assignment 1 is due in a couple of days, at the end of this week. So the most important thing, of course, is I need you to, as a team, to email me a one-page report. Well, it can be 1 or 2 pages, but pretty brief report. Okay, so the assignment 2 is also posted. It is due end of next week. As I said at the beginning of the class, the goal of the assignments are to essentially help you with your presentations, the 3 of them during the class semester. So the second assignment is for you to essentially describe your innovation. So I tried to give you guidance. Treat this as just guidelines, and you can use your own judgment on how to describe it. So most importantly, the report must be relatively short. So I said, maybe about 3 pages or so. And these are the guidelines. Describe your chosen innovation. So I mentioned last time you have to do a brainstorming. So, so you select 1 or 2 or your best approach. Describe what problem are you trying to solve. What challenges do you expect to see when you're trying to implement your innovation? So just think ahead about what sort of problems you might face, and how would you address those challenges? And these 2 things, of course, relate to a plan. So that's why I said come up with a rough plan to bring your innovation to life. So it's kind of a kind of a proposal. Let's think about it that way, but a very rough, relatively brief proposal, and this will help you when you do your presentation in 2 weeks. Okay, just keep in mind the presentation is due is on September 28th, so keep that in mind. Okay, any questions about assignment 2 before I move on?
No.
Okay, everyone's clear. Are all the teams making progress on assignment 1? It is due in a couple of days, so I hope you are. Okay. Well, if you, let me reiterate, if you have any problems, make sure you email me or the TA, and we'll respond very, very quickly. Okay. Another quick announcement about the lecture on Thursday. So let me just point that out first. So on Thursday, we have a tutorial on optical ray tracing by Dr. Nazmul Hazan. And the lecture notes are here. So it would be very useful if you bring your laptops to the class. If you don't have one, that's okay. But if you have one, please bring them. Because then you are able to run the example design problems on your own laptop. And you can actually download Oslo for free here. So take a look at it today because it takes a couple of days. And if you can download and install it before class and bring it with you, that would be very, very useful. So if you click here, it brings you to the Lambda Research Corporation's University Programs page, and you can read through it. What you want to get is Oslo, which is the ray tracing program. And it works only for Windows at the moment. So, you might have to, if you have a Mac, you might have to run Parallel, so some kind of Windows emulator. And the installer is right there. And there are some conditions here, so you need to read through it. There are documentation that you don't need to read through right now, but if you want to install it, you need to read through the restrictions and the qualifications and so on. So you have to provide a copy of your course syllabus, so you can put send a link to the class website and so on. And if they insist that they need a letter from me, just let me know, and I'm happy to provide that as well. You have to fill this out. And at the end of the course, you're supposed to provide a short report. It can be just a couple of pages, and you can just use your final report from your class itself as for that. What's great about this, of course, is that these programs are relatively expensive, usually several $1,000s. So it's nice that you're getting access to this for free as part of this class, and so really take advantage of it. What I would recommend is, install it, play around with it. These things are very powerful. It helps you design lots of really complicated things, and particularly for your project, I would really encourage you to use these ray tracing tools to simulate whatever optics innovation that you will come up with for your project. So I highly recommend it. So it's a great opportunity for you to learn this. So again, just go to the website here and try to install and run it before you come to class on Thursday. Okay, so any questions about that? Everyone okay with that? Okay, good. So today our class is on optical design for recycling. So this is actually a very different sort of lecture, and it's somewhat shorter than usual as well. But everything I'll talk about in this class is based on an article which is linked here. So if you click on this, you can actually read the article. It's written by, it's called the Optics for Recycling. It's written by Andreas Nordbrinn, who happened to be an entrepreneur who started a company some time ago now in the 70s, applying optics for recycling. I also put another article here, which is kind of interesting to read. It talks about some more recent innovations that are happening. Okay, so let's jump right into the lecture. So this is, you can read this. This is quite interesting as well. It talks about optical sorting, which we'll talk about as well. Okay, so let's jump right in. So my recommendation first is that in the lectures, I'll give a somewhat of a big picture overview, but I would recommend reading that article, which is from a few years ago now, but it's still quite interesting and useful. So, okay, so the major focus of this class is how we apply optics and optical engineering to extract energy, right? So from sunlight or, in various forms or other means as well. But of course, in the energy space, recycling is also very important in the sense that resource conservation is actually a very effective way to conserve energy. And that's the purpose of this whole lecture, is to give you a flavor for how optics is applied in this very interesting and different space than what you might have encountered in the past. So the idea is relatively straightforward. The key application we look at is what's referred to as reverse vending machines. So of course, there are many ways to think about this, and I will try to emphasize that throughout the lecture. But the most important thing is what's referred to as a reverse vending machine. And you all have seen this in supermarkets and so on. Essentially, it's a machine which looks like that, where you can put in recyclable materials, typically cans, aluminum cans, glass bottles, plastic bottles, etc. And in return, it can return either a credit for the store or actual cash, it's money. And these things are very common in the developed world, where there is actually a fairly mature market and system for these industries. So there are fairly large companies that operate in this space. Some of these, which you might not have heard of, but they're relatively bigger. In Week4 in the US, Week4, Nixdorf in Germany, Tomra in Norway. So the article is actually written by the founder of Tomra, based in Norway. So these, first of all, tend to be concentrated in the developed world, because you actually need to develop a market for this, right? So you need to have political policies that encourage people to essentially, so you need to do two things. One is, when you purchase your can of Coca-Cola, you need to actually pay an extra deposit. So in the US, it tends turns out to be about 5 cents. It depends on the state, of course. And you can get that 5 cents back when you return this can, right? This is the idea. And a lot of, there's a big industry around this, clearly. Now, from a technical point of view, and we'll come back to some of the policy issues there as well. But from a technical point of view, the key thing we have to recognize is that this machine has to somehow recognize various different kinds of recyclable materials and be able to essentially sort them into different bins, okay? So you need to identify and sort waste, and typically high speeds. I mean, in these individual machines, it doesn't need to be super high speeds. We'll talk about some centralized facilities where higher speed is important, but it's important to identify them and sort them into multiple categories. What that means is, of course, you can put in essentially a Coca-Cola can, or you can put in a plastic bottle of Coca-Cola, and the machine must be able to separate them out, because at the end of the day, you need to be able to separate the aluminum can from the plastic bottle, because they end up going to different processing plants, essentially. Let me close my email so it doesn't. Hold on. Oops. Okay.
Yeah, but he asked me to put on the lights so that, yeah.
Is it hard to see the screen?
Some of the pictures are little.
Is it dark? Or you can turn off the lights and try. It's fine.
It's okay. It's okay. It's okay.
I'm just curious.
Is it okay?
Yeah, it's okay.
Right. So that's where optics comes in. You need to be able to distinguish two things, right? You need to be able to distinguish different materials, and you need to be able to distinguish different shapes. Okay. So it's not an easy problem to solve, and you need to do it relatively fast with very high accuracy. The first approach is a shape measurement technique. So in other words, you need to know if it's a can, or whether it's a bottle, or if it's a particular kind of bottle, what different kinds, it could be a glass bottle, plastic bottle, whatever. So some of the original technology that was applied was primarily for shape measurement, and high accuracy is needed. And there are many ways to do this, right? Of course, you can imagine nowadays you can apply cameras and image processing essentially to achieve this. But in the early systems, this was done using simple photocells. So the way this system works is actually quite simple. You have a conveyor belt, and you have some robotics or some simple pneumatic systems back here where is there a question?
No.
Okay. So there are some initial systems back here which essentially send the bottle or can or whatever down the conveyor belt. And what you essentially have is a laser, and which you can see right there, and a detector, usually on the other side. So these are shown on the same side. And it's like the detector you have in your garage door opener. So when the bottle passes through, it interrupts the laser signal, and you can see by knowing the speed at which it's moving and at what times the signal is interrupted at the beginning and at the end, you can actually figure out, okay, how long is the bottle, for instance, right? And by putting these detectors and lasers at appropriate positions, you can actually figure out what the shape of the actual bottle is, whether it's a can, bottle, and so on. So that was one of the earlier approaches. So it required, of course, multiple detectors, multiple lasers, and they're all infrared typically. Of course, some control algorithms which allow you to essentially separate out based on shapes. And it's there are, of course, big problems with this, because if you have slightly different shapes, or if you come up with, if someone comes up with a new product without really upgrading the system with more sensors and so on, it becomes difficult to recognize them. So it becomes like a solution that is a little bit more challenging to upgrade. Okay, so to improve on these, Tomra actually came up with one of the first innovations, which was to apply laser range finding. So let's see what that means. First of all, laser range finding is essentially an approach to measure distances based on the propagation of a laser beam. Okay, so you have a laser beam that is modulated in time. So you essentially have a laser beam that is, is on and off, right? It's modulated in time, and it is reflected off some object. Okay, so the light essentially bounces off some surface and it comes back. The phase of this reflected modulated laser is now shifted because of the propagation of light. So light has traveled to some distance and come back based on the distance of the target. Now, then you can measure the distance by extracting this phase shift. And this is, we won't go into the detail, but this is done using what's called interferometry, okay? Now, I should point out the laser range finding is actually now a very important field, because this is a very common technique used by autonomous cars today. You might have heard of LiDARs. LiDAR essentially is a laser rangefinder that rotates so you can get 3D information in all 360-degree angles. Okay, so you might have seen, for instance, in the Google car, on the top of the Google car, this little dome that actually rotates over the 360 degrees, and it's essentially the same technique here. There are, of course, more sophisticated algorithms that are applied to make sure these things are very, very fast as well. So it's a very, very interesting technology, very, very applicable today as well. One interesting exception to LiDAR is, of course, the Tesla. Tesla does not use LiDAR, it uses cameras, which is relevant to the next slide we'll talk about in a few minutes. So let's take a quick look at this system, which is an example of a laser rangefinder system that is used to image a crate. Okay, so a crate is basically containing a large number of bottles, whatever, Coke or beer or whatever. These crates can be inserted into this machine, and the laser essentially scans along the semicircle. Okay, so the laser has to scan, because you need to essentially, the laser bounces, so the laser comes this way, bounces off some surface here, let's say a crate containing a bottle, comes back here to the detector. The laser and the detector are scanning together, and then the face and the 3D map of that particular location is actually calculated, and the laser moves and repeats it. And of course, it does this very, very fast. Okay, as it moves this way. So by moving this way, it can actually create a full three-dimensional map of this crate and figure out, okay, how many bottles are there? What kind of bottles are they? Are they cans versus bottles, whatever. Okay, so it can do a full three-dimensional shape measurement. So in this particular case, it's a scanning laser rangefinder, and diameter here is about 50 centimeters, so fairly big, as you can imagine. And of course, it also has to be relatively fast, right? Because this would not be for a single consumer system, but in fairly large centralized facilities where large numbers of crates are coming through in a conveyor belt. So, of course, there are several challenges here, as you can imagine. One is, you need to be able to design the system to be very robust, right? So if your laser power changes, or if the laser starts dying or something like that, you need to make sure your algorithms that actually grab this data are able to account for any variations in laser power and things like that. Also, you can imagine, different materials reflect light differently, so you need to be able to account for that. For instance, metal will reflect a lot more than a plastic, for instance, right? At least in the near infrared wavelengths where these things are implemented. Okay, so that's one example, and I have a short video here which shows another irrelevant but an interesting application of laser range finding. Okay, so let's take a quick look at this and play the sound as well. Maybe there's no sound. So basically, this is a laser rangefinder which is used in golf, and this gives you an idea of how this works. So basically, you can see
it's fairly simple to activate. Simply press the power button down, It puts the laser into continuous mode, and you can scan the pin or whatever else you're after. So this particular pin on our range is 88 yards away. So this takes a little bit of the guesswork out of the round of golf for the player. They don't need to walk around and look for a sprinkler head. Simply shoot your pin, hit your number, and play on.
Okay, so this is pretty simple, right? So basically the way this is basically applying the modulated laser beam, which is reflecting off an object to get its distance. And that's exactly what's happening here as well, but you're doing that at every point as you move this laser. Okay, and of course, in this particular case, you could have many other materials other than, you know, something in this case where you expect only a, you know, golf flag or whatever. So you might need it to be much more reliable and of course much faster and so on, right? So it's a bit more complicated device. Okay, so the more modern techniques use what's referred to as a stereo vision system. So this is analogous to what Tesla does in its self-driving car compared to what the Google self-driving car does. So in the Google self-driving car and most of the self-driving cars utilize LiDAR, which is very much like a laser rangefinder. A bit more complicated, of course. But the Tesla actually uses two cameras or multiple cameras to essentially gain the same information. And this is similar to what happens in these recycling systems. They essentially take advantage of what can be thought of as stereo vision systems. Okay, so it's inspired by nature. You combine two cameras and image processing for fast, accurate shape recognition. As we, as humans, have two eyes, we can actually get perceptual three-dimensional information. We can use two cameras to do the same thing, just like people do in robotics and self-driving cars and so on. And the idea is simple. If you have a real object which has three-dimensional shape, if you only look at it with one eye, there is this ambiguity of where that object is. And you can actually do this in your own with your own eye, you can close one eye, but you have to look at something that you haven't seen before. So otherwise your brain will automatically compensate for it. So if you, for instance, look at an object that you weren't looking at previously, then you know, there's some ambiguity whether the object is here, here, or here, because if you look at it with one eye, in the monocular vision case, they all will look the same. Okay, so all of these are possible perceptual images, even though this is the real object. But if you look at it with two eyes, you can actually, one eye will see one side of the object which is slightly shifted, and the other eye will see a slightly different object. And our brain essentially puts these two slightly shifted objects together to create the full three-dimensional perception of an object. So our brain does this image processing automatically. So the idea is in 3D imaging in general is to take advantage of this natural approach with two cameras and having two different views of a scene. And by knowing the locations of these cameras, you can actually build a full three-dimensional view of the scene. And that's, for instance, what's shown here. You can kind of, you know, look at, you know, one eye seeing one side, another eye seeing another side, and building both of them together to get three-dimensional views. Another application, for instance, is for those of you who might play video games, the Microsoft Xbox actually utilizes something very similar for its 3D cameras. So there are in this 3D camera, there are actually two cameras that look at the same scene, and there's image processing that allows those two cameras to build up a 3D detail of your living room or whatever. So when you move around, it can place you in the game. So it's a very, very important technology. And of course, the idea is that we can apply the same technique to do shape recognition and in the recycling vending machines or in the large scale sorting, optical sorting capabilities. Okay, so we should make a couple of notes coming back to the recycling markets. First of all, there are many different types of markets where this is applied in. You can have, and the technology that's applied can vary quite drastically based on the market where it's applied, the application where it's used in. So you can have situations where you have a single use versus multi-use containers. Single use basically means that the container, if it's sorted out, is then essentially destroyed, right? It's actually squashed and turned into something else. A good example would be aluminum cans. Aluminum cans essentially get squashed and sold on the commodity markets, and the aluminum then gets turned into something else, right? For some other use. You can also have multi-use containers, which used to be more popular, but an example would be glass containers, which are basically cleaned and reused again and again. Not so popular nowadays. But in these two situations, the technology could be quite different in terms of how you process the sorted material. So it's important to keep those ideas in mind when someone tries to design the optical system. Another important note here about container deposits. So as I said before, when you buy your soda cans, for instance, there is a small deposit that you have to pay in most states in the U.S. This container deposit is implemented under the assumption that the customer will essentially reclaim this deposit by returning this container. And the reason to do this is to incentivize people to recycle these materials, right? So you don't send these to landfills and so on. What's very interesting about this, and of course you can recognize this from your own life as well, is that you don't necessarily return 100% of all the cans, right? So sometimes you're lazy or you put it in the wrong container, whatever. You don't have the time. So which means that these container deposits that you've already paid is essentially not reclaimed by the person who paid it. So for instance, if I buy a Coke and I simply toss it into the landfill, the 5 cents that I've paid when I bought the Coke is essentially remaining in the system, right? I haven't reclaimed it. It's gone. I mean, it's not gone. It's in the system, which means that the people who do not recycle, and that can be a lot of money, right? It remains in the system because over, hundreds of thousands of millions of people. This means that the non-participants in the system actually can finance the actual expensive equipment that is used in the optical sorting. So it's a very, very interesting sort of market. And it's interesting to think about it from a policy point of view. And as a technologist, I must also emphasize that it's important for you as technologists to understand the policy initiatives that give rise to industries and that incentivize industries. So it's important to think along these lines as well. Of course, the vast majority of this industry is non-deposit. So like I said, even in the US, only maybe 10, 12, 15 states have deposits. Most other states don't. Which means that these recycling markets are almost exclusively driven by commodity prices. And this is not a bad thing because commodity prices can be relatively high, particularly for certain types of plastics and metals and so on, right? So commodity prices drive this industry. And they can support, that means these prices essentially support these complicated equipment which are used for sorting. Now, it turns out the commodity prices will give you a higher price if your sorting accuracy is much higher. In other words, if someone is able to sell a particular kind of plastic with 99.99% accuracy versus someone else can sell that plastic with, let's say, 90% accuracy, the first person can actually command a much higher price because it's a pure material, whether it's plastic, metal, copper, whatever, right? So that means that the reliability or the accuracy of optical sorting is very, very critical, okay? So the accurate sorting drives the price that you can command. And of course, at the end of the day, the biggest cost factor is transportation because these things are big and bulky and you need to pay for fuel for transporting it and time and so on, and drivers and so on. So this tends to be very expensive. So lots of innovation happens here in how to very efficiently transport the recycled sorted materials. Okay, so a little bit different than a little bit off topic from optics, but that's something we should also be aware of. Now, so far we have talked primarily about sorting materials based on shape, right? But imagine you have transparent plastics or colored plastics, but you need to sort them based on their material. Okay, and this is very challenging because all the materials basically look the same, right? If you use a camera, for instance, you won't be able to tell the difference between a plastic number 1 versus plastic number 2. So I'm sure many of you are aware that in recycling markets, plastics are numbered from something like 1 to 6. In some places it's more, but 1 to 6 is very common. So you can actually look at this. If you have a bottle, you can look underneath and it'll give you a little triangle with a number on it. And that tells you what kind of plastic it is. And like I said before, the value of the sorted material is higher if you can sort them into the same type. In other words, plastic 1 should all be with plastic 1, or plastic 2 should be all with plastic 2, and so on, which means that your sorting machine, the best approach for a sorting machine is to be able to sort those plastics based on those numbers, right? So the most common approach in order to do this is what's called near-infrared spectroscopy, okay? And the reason is because if you actually look at these plastics, you can't tell the difference. They basically all look the same. And the different names for plastics are, for instance, polycarbonate, which is PC, for instance. Polycarbonate is very commonly used for eyeglasses, for instance, or PET, polyethylene phthalate, polyethylene itself, PE, PEN, PVC is very common, polyvinyl cellulose, polystyrene, PS, or PP, and there are many different versions of it. Now, you can use near-infrared spectroscopy to separate them because if you look at the transmission of light, so this is transmission of light through the plastic as a function of the wavelength of light in the near-infrared range. So this is 1.5 microns. 1.7 and 2. So these are invisible wavelengths, right? This is in the infrared. If you look at the transmittance, you will see these characteristics, absorption spectra, or absorption dips, absorption peaks, which show us as transmission dips. So this orange curve here represents, let's see, actually this is red, represents a polycarbonate. If it's green, yeah, use PET, right? You can see there's a difference. So this looks like that, that looks like that. So relying on the signature of this transmission spectra, you can actually separate them out. Okay, of course, to do this is not easy. It's hard. Like you can, many reasons for this. First of all, you can imagine that these spectra may not be super repeatable. If the bottle is dirty, for instance, you might end up with lots of noise in your signal, and then how do you separate them out? So you have to apply a lot of signal processing to the data that comes in, right? And you have, of course, you also need to design your optical system to get the cleanest possible signal you can get. Now we'll talk about some example designs here. But the simplest way to think about this is you can imagine you take a tunable infrared laser, right? This is tunable, meaning you're changing the wavelength, and you simply pass it through a piece of plastic and measure how much power passes through. As you scan the wavelength of the laser, you measure how much power has passed through, and you get these curves. So if it's polycarbonate, you would expect to get a curve like this, and you apply an cross-correlation of the measured data to some database where you have an expected spectra, and then you try to match it. So if the cross-correlation is very high, that means, okay, now I have high confidence to say, okay, that's polycarbonate, or that's polyethylene, or whatever. Okay, so it's a combination of a fairly complicated optical design with fairly sophisticated signal processing. Okay, not easy, but, and of course, it also has to be done really, really fast, right? Especially if you're trying to process huge volumes, as we'll talk about in some situations. So these things have to go really, really fast as well. So it's a fairly challenging optics and computational and controls problem. Okay, so let's look at a very simple solution that this was proposed by, again, Tomra, what they refer to as correlation spectroscopy. So this is a relatively inexpensive and a simple solution. The idea is instead of doing a full scan of a laser as shown here and measuring this spectra very precisely, what they decided to do was to essentially take a halogen lamp with a filter. So all these wavelengths are essentially passing through at the same time. So it's a big lamp, okay? Halogen lamps are relatively cheap, and you filter out all the visible light, so you only get the near infrared coming through. So that's easy, you get all this light. And then you simply pass it through the bottle or plastic or whatever you're looking at and correlate that against a filter wheel, which looks like this. Okay, so you have the halogen lamp passing through these are little pieces of plastic typically, okay, in this filter wheel. These are the plastics that, let's say, you're looking for. So you pass, this filter wheel essentially rotates. The beam passes through each of these little windows one at a time, okay? So it passes through this, and you measure it on what's called an indium gallium arsenide detector. You need an indium gallium arsenide detector because this is infrared, so you cannot use a conventional silicon detectors. You need these compound semiconductors. In fact, this turns out to be the most expensive part of the system. So one side of the beam actually passes through this filter wheel where you get one value. And on the other side of the beam, which is not shown, you pass the light through the plastic that you're measuring. It looks kind of like this, okay? And then you compare them. So the signal you get from here versus signal you get from here, and you try to correlate them. Okay, so you have all these different plastics, and you try to correlate what happens, which one matches the transmission of the plastic that you're looking at. And then you apply some cross-correlation algorithms to get with high confidence what kind of plastic it is. Of course, there are limitations to the system, in the most important one being that you are limited to the types of plastics that are embedded here, right? So if someone comes up with a new kind of plastic, you have to change this filter wheel, which is not a big deal. It's just relatively inexpensive, but you can. And this is really fast because you can spin this really fast, right? It's just a wheel that sits on this axle here and just spins.
I have a question.
Sure. Yeah, is there a question? Yeah.
Yeah, so you spin this and you compare it to the plastic, right? That's what you're saying?
Yes.
Why can't you just look at the filter wheel once and then store all that information? Why do you have to keep looking back at the same plastic?
You can. Yes, that's a good point. You can. The way it's done typically is you do this in real time because you want to make sure. So the way it happens is you want to make, what happens if the lamp loses power over time or something changes over time. So you're trying to avoid any variation. So the way it works is you take the light from the lamp, split into two. One goes this way and the other half goes this way, and you can compare them. And that becomes a much more reliable measurement. What you're saying is fine. As long as the lamp is very stable and the whole environment is very stable, you can just grab all the data and store it and simply take one side of the measurement and compare it to your stored data. That's also okay. But this turns out to be much more robust, and it's relatively easy to do so.
Okay.
Yeah, and of course you can think about many other variations to this approach, right? Again, the goal here is to try to make it as simple and as fast and as reliable as possible. So this is just one approach. Another approach, which is actually quite clever and a bit more precise. So as I said before, one of the problems here is, of course, you're limited to these types of plastics. So if you cannot actually get a spectra like you would like here. If you can actually get this spectra, then you can very precisely distinguish between very closely related plastics and so on, right? And then it's much more valuable because you can get much higher precision. So in order to do that, these guys came up with a very, very clever invention. So let's look at this carefully because it's a very interesting optical solution to this particular problem, okay? They designed what's called a diffractive-optical element for low-cost spectrometry. Now, a diffractive optical element is an optical element like a lens that you learned in your geometrical optics class, but now it operates by diffraction as opposed to refraction, okay? Like a diffraction grating. But this is not a grating. It's a bit more complicated than this. It looks like this, for instance. Okay, you can see the different colors that are reflected off it. So the way it works is very interesting. It takes a point source, the light from here, and it essentially acts like a lens in reflection. So it takes a point source and focuses the light, let's say, to a point, right? So it forms the image of this point source, acting like a reflective lens. The light comes from here, bounces off here, and forms a point there. Now, in addition to just be acting like a lens, it also acts like a grating. In other words, instead of forming a single point here, it splits the colors in this axis. The blue colors get focused here, the green focuses here, the yellow focuses here, the red focuses here. You see, it's a combination of a lens and a grating. Okay, so that's very nice because it's a very compact, and it can be made in a relatively cheap manner using embossing techniques, which we will talk about later on in other lectures. I'll point this out. Now, then what happens is that this, again, keep in mind that we're trying to get the spectrum passing through a plastic. So you have a detector which is fixed at this location, let's say, okay? Now, what you do is this diffractive-optical element, DOE, is rotated. You see this angle here? It's tilted slightly, and it vibrates about some axis. And the result of that vibration is that this dispersed pattern essentially moves back and forth like that. Okay, and the result of this motion is that the detector, if you look at this, sit at this fixed detector, this detector will see different wavelengths. It'll see at different instances of time. It'll see blue, green, red, and of course these are done at the infrared, not just visible. So you get all these colors at different instances of time. So now you're able to get spectral information on the detector simply with this piece of plastic, which is rotating back, which is simply vibrating back and forth here. And then you put your piece of plastic in between the detector and this element, and you can get the transmission measurement. So this allows you to, and this is very small motion, okay? So that means it can go really, really, really fast. So this approach allows you to get the full spectral information in very, very, very fast with a single point detector, which is relatively cheap, and a single point source, like a halogen lamp with a filter on it. Okay, so it's a very clever folded optical design. It's very small, it's compact, so it's a very nice design. So it's a good example of an optical innovation. Okay, just to summarize again, a single diffractive optical element is used for beam splitting, spectrum separation, and focusing. Okay, so beam splitting means beam splitting and spectrum separation refers to the same thing, right? They're basically separating all the different colors in that axis, and it's also focusing in the horizontal axis. Okay. So now this is actually relevant to us when we talk about photovoltaics, concentrated photovoltaics. For instance, in one of the lectures in the second half of this class semester, we'll talk about a diffractive element that spectrally separates sunlight into different bands like this. And then you can use different photovoltaic semiconductor materials to absorb the different colors very, very efficiently. So we'll talk about these later on. Another important point to keep in mind is that these things are relatively cheap to make at high volumes. So it's similar to the security holograms that you might have seen in your credit cards, and also similar to the technology used to make DVDs and CDs and so on. So relatively simple embossing techniques. Okay, so so far we have only talked primarily about consumer level sorting, so which are relatively slow in the scheme of things. But once there are also very large scale material sorting. So for instance, when you put your recycling out on the street, and the recycling trucks come and get it, those recycling materials, of course, are not sorted at home, right? You put in your paper with your plastics all together. Glass is, of course, different, sorted in Salt Lake, so it's you have to sort glass, and there's a reason for that, because the technology used to sort glass versus plastics or paper is very different. Okay, it's more expensive for glass, and glass, of course, also commands a higher price in general, so you can afford to actually have a separate stream. But many other cities in the US, they're all mixed together. So at the end of the day, these trucks essentially go to a central facility which is run by the city or municipality or whatever, where you have very large scale material sorting. So municipal and other large scale waste can contain valuable material resources, but requires large-scale high-throughput sorting. So this can be huge. You can have things like 30 tons of waste per hour going through systems. So here you have to have multiple ways of sorting, not just shape recognition or infrared spectroscopy. You need to have everything because you don't know what's coming at you, and you can also have things that are completely unknown, right? Because you don't know what these waste streams are. So typically people use near-infrared spectroscopy and visible spectra, so RGB, red, green, blue color spectra, captured with relatively high spatial resolution at very, very high speed, so a few centimeters resolution at high speeds. Now this, of course, depends on the material that is being sorted, can be lower. Now the reason people do this is because the material commodity prices can support this. Aluminum, for instance, costs in the order of $1 per pound. This last year, can be melted and recast into containers and other items. Plastics can cost even more depending upon the type. It can be $1.30 per kilogram, something like that. From a few years ago, plastics turned into fiber, use of fleece, fabrics, etc. So this is the reason why people do it, and it's a very, very large industry, just to keep in mind. So this is an example of a large-scale material recovery facility. So it looks like this. These are very giant machines with huge conveyors passing through. And essentially you have a scanner which looks down on it, typically. In this particular system, so the material is coming from here, passing right through there. And you have incident light in this particular example from the sides here. And the reflected light is collected. And this can be used for spectroscopy or shape recognition or typically for both. And based on that, you make a decision whether the material should be pushed into this bin or allowed to go into this bin. So you see here a little spray, which is a pneumatic spray with air typically. It pushes this plastic bottle, for instance, into this container, whereas everything else pours here. Okay, and of course this has to happen really, really fast. So that means this image processing has to happen orders of magnitude faster than the speed at which this is going. So it can tell this pneumatic pump to essentially do this, right? So it's a fairly complicated controls problem, you can imagine. And of course, optics problem as well. Here, of course, you have the advantage that you can control the speed at which it's coming, although it cannot be much slower. And the second thing is you can control how much light you pass in. So you can actually get a pretty high signal to noise ratio. So you can design this optical system to be quite good. Okay, so this is a MRF material recovery facility running at full speed, sorting valuable materials from a municipal waste stream. So you can see this example, the incident light is generated by a number of reflector halogen lamps. So you use multiple of them. Reflected light is imaged and spectrally analyzed in the scanner. So like I said, image for shape and spectrally analyzed for material discrimination. So let's take a quick look at, actually I want to go to this one and take a look, actually let's come back here. I want to show you an example of a student project that one of the teams did for this class a few years ago. And this is a good example because it's of course about this topic, optics for recycling, but it gives you also a good idea of what I expect to see at the end of this class. So this is an example where the students, the topic that was assigned to this team was optics for recycling. And they took that, created an innovation, and created a video to explain it. So this is gives you two things to think about. One is, an interesting innovation in this space, and the second thing is, what do you have to do at the end of this class in terms of your video submission? So let's take a quick look at this. And there should be
Plastics LLC would like to introduce you.
So again, this is how they made up their name and so on. So just as an example. So, okay, let's take a quick look at it. It's fairly short.
To a distributed optical plastic sorting method by simply reading the SPI resin code on the consumer plastic waste. Distributed Plastics LLC is backed by Bing Shen, a PhD candidate, and Joseph Bogue, a master's degree student, both at the University of Utah's Electrical and Computer Engineering departments. Currently, consumer recycling is done in a big box manner, whereby large trucks go from house to house picking up recyclables. They then take these recyclables back to the plant where they have to sort them, compact them, and bale them for sale. Although this big box sorting method is proven day after day, these sorters are expensive because of advanced methods of discrimination. These sorters use visual and infrared wavelengths, spectroscopy methods where actual elemental makeup is determined, X-ray imaging for difficult materials, and lastly, the human element for anything that might have been missed. Although these big box sorters are marvelous feats of engineering, they come at a large monetary cost, both initially and through time. Now, in a recent case study done in Salt Lake Municipal's Recycling Center, they recently made...
Let me just point out that they actually did talk to people at the municipal plant here to get some data. So this is a very, very good example of as what I want you to understand as engineers. It's not just a question of technology. You actually need to interact with the people who use the technology and to see if it's valuable for them. Okay, so let's continue.
A $7 million sorting capability upgrade. This upgrade is a great improvement for them. However, if recycling in general is done in a distributed manner instead, these types of costs can be greatly reduced. Now, before we get into the innovative technology, we need to review plastic resin. Remember that plastic is a synthetic material made from a wide range of organic polymers like polyethylene, PVC, and nylon. These polymers can be molded into virtually any shape and are easy to recycle if kept in the same resin family. This is why it is important. Keeping these polymers together allows for efficient recycling and more dollar per bale. Notice the code, the SPI resin code on this plastic bottle. Now, simply put, our innovative idea is a smart garbage can. This smart garbage can will take the plastic bottle, find and read the SPI code, and drop it into the appropriate internal compartment. It is centered around consumer plastic bottle waste and will automatically sort it as you walk away. It has 8 columnar sections, 1 for each SPI code and 1 as overflow, with a center hollow section that will contain smart electronics. Above this center columnar section is a domed top with an enclosure that holds the plastic bottle on an incline. When the bottle is dropped in, the algorithm reads the SPI code from the image, determines which bin to rotate towards, and opens a door and lets gravity take over to do the sort. Notice here, prototype overview, a high-resolution camera sends an image to MATLAB. The patentable detection algorithm then decodes the SPI code and sends that value out via serial data to a microcontroller. The microcontroller then drives a stepper motor and actuates a door to open, dropping the bottle, and sorting. Actual prototype results show a noise-induced, hand-drawn images sent to MATLAB. MATLAB detection algorithm for successfully detecting the SPI code and sending that data via serial to a microcontroller. The microcontroller then correctly drives a stepper motor to the correct SPI code location, and a LED will blink showing or simulating that a door has opened. Now, our claim...
Let me make a quick point about that, by the way. So they did something very clever. First of all, of course, it's not a innovation in optics. It's an innovation in a system, which is fine for the class. So it's a good example. If you're thinking about innovations that are not necessarily directly linked to optics. The second thing and more important thing I want to point out is that they actually built what he shows here, right? This thing right here. He actually built it, and they showed this as a example in class. So of course this is not a full garbage can, but they emulated the system simply by just very simple setup, but just to prove the concept, right? So something like this would be a great way, for instance, to show it. Of course, if you can actually, if you're doing a solar desalination, if you can actually desalinate the water, that would be even better. But this is an example of one of the things that you could try to do, right? Okay. Again, none of this is mandatory. I'm giving you ideas to think about how when you start doing your innovation. Okay, let's continue with the last part of this presentation because this is actually important because it relates to the commercialization aspect of it, which is the part which most of us as engineers find the most difficult. The innovation part is usually easier and the technical part is easier. So let's take a quick look at what they did. And of course, every team and every topic is different. So keep that in mind as well. So, you know, their particular value proposition is very different than what it could be for your team. But this is a good way to think about it. Let's take a quick look.
Now, our claim with this market potential is that Salt Lake County conservatively has a potential for a 30% increase in volume and a 3x decrease in cost if using a distributed plastic sorting method. The nitty-gritty of this claim follow. Salt Lake Municipal per week has a conservative capacity of 336,000 kilograms per week. Another conservative estimate of our distributed methods shows 431,000 kilograms per week, depending on the volume. Another conservative estimate over 30 years shows our distributed method costing $22 million, whereby the large big box sorters have a infrastructure, maintenance, and overhead cost of $70.5 million. Again, this reflects our claim as 3x reduction in cost. Remember, Distributed Plastics LLC, we thank you for your consideration.
Okay, perfect. So that gives you an idea of an example of you know, a video that you will have to do as a team by the end of the semester, right? So again, just to summarize, you have a problem that they identified. There's an innovation which solves that problem or market potential. And then there's some sort of a validation of that technology, let's say, with a prototype or simulations or whatever. And then there's this market study to explain, okay, why is this valuable? Of course, in this video, you can go into huge detail about the business proposition and so on, which is why you also submit a more detailed commercialization plan, which is your very final assignment, part of the final assignment as well. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, no. So the last thing I want to show you is basically just another example of an optical sorter that is used not just to give you an idea that these things are not used only for recycling. It's also very widely used in the agriculture industry. Okay, so this is an example from the grape industry, and so in other words, these technologies are applicable in a very, very large industrial space. So let's take a quick look at this. Whoops. Let's see. It's referred to recording. So let's take a quick look. So you can see how incredibly fast it is. So you have to actually make the decision. So you can see the pneumatic injectors are used here to essentially blow the rotten grapes away into a different stream. So you can watch. Yeah, you can see that. Okay, so that was just a plant in Germany, so one of those companies. So of course, this is not just for grapes; it's very widely applied for tomatoes, avocados, all kinds of fruit and vegetables, right? And you can also imagine the same kind of things can be used in sorting, other things as well based on color. I don't know, jelly beans or all kinds of food items. Anyway, so the last thing I want to talk about is the assignments. So we're almost done. But again, keep in mind the first assignment is due September 15th, just to repeat what I said at the very beginning for those of you who might have come in late. The second assignment is due September 22nd. I recommend submitting a report, which is maybe 3 pages at most. If you need more space, that's fine, but try to keep it brief. The goal is to describe your chosen innovation. What problem are you trying to solve? What are the main challenges in implementing this innovation? How will you overcome these challenges? So this is in a way for you to kind of think ahead of, what are the issues that I will, or as a team that you will encounter, and how will you address them? From a big picture point of view, you don't need to go into huge detail because you don't have much room. And then finally come up with a rough plan for bringing your innovation to life. And you can use your judgment for this, whether it's technical issues, whether it's financial issues, whether it's figuring out who will pay for it, whatever it is, right? All of these will be challenges, in my opinion. Okay, and so let me stop here and see if there are any questions on anything in this class.
Okay. Good.
No? Is that everyone okay? Okay. In that case, let's end here. And I know there's about 10 minutes left in the class, 15 minutes. I would say take this opportunity to discuss with your team members about the first assignment, the 2 assignments and the presentation, which is of course important for your grade. So great, thank you. And of course, email me or Subhashish if you have any questions or concerns. Oh, again, for those of you who came in last, make sure you take a look for Thursday's lecture. Try to download the Oslo version for the ray tracing here. It's on the class website. So,
Yeah, I'll make an announcement.
Okay. Sounds good.